RackTop systems. ZEROTRUST or a CIO, CISO, and CEO walk into a bar.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the session on ZEROTRUST. I don't want to disappoint anybody out of the gate, but if you thought we were going to pour drinks at this, I'm sorry. I wanted to. Gartner would not let us. But I'm happy to meet you outside afterwards for a drink. In our presentation today, I want to cover a few topics, specifically around data and data security, and how ZEROTRUST as a model can help us to better protect data within our organizations. This is not going to be a deep dive on ZEROTRUST, but I am going to talk about some of the high-level components of ZEROTRUST, and then what are some of its failings so that we could actually address the problem that we have within our organizations relative to data. And so just to sort of get an idea, I'm sure most of you have heard of ZEROTRUST. Does everybody kind of have an idea? I mean, this is such a common topic right now. Is anybody an expert? Does anybody have this thing figured out? Okay, I don't think I see any hands. Oh, I see one hand, maybe. Okay, sir, could you please leave the room right now? No, kidding. That's right. So just to start off a little bit about me. I'm the CEO and co-founder of RackTop Systems, and I spent probably the last 20 years in the national intelligence space. So I spent a big part of my career building, designing systems that store, collect, analyze, and protect massive amounts of data. And at RackTop, the product that we built comes from the experiences that myself and other members of the team had in that world. And so, if you sort of think about, some of you may be in a space or in an organization similar to that. But if, you can sort of conceptualize the massive amounts of data that you're dealing with, and that data security must be intrinsic in everything you do, or else lives could potentially be lost. People could go to jail if things are mishandled. And so data security is something that cannot be separated. Those two words cannot be separated. And so it's a very critical component to how we manage data within our enterprise, and it is a core component of ZEROTRUST and how we apply that model. But today really is not about me in RackTop, but it's really about the relationship between the CIO, the CISO, and the CEO, and how those three individuals can come together to actually solve the problem within the organization. Now, these three individuals, they sometimes have an interesting relationship. They have common goals from a business perspective, but sometimes operationally they conflict with each other, right? And so you think about the needs of the business, the need to constantly drive down expenses, are at direct conflict with the needs to actually protect the digital assets of the organization to the level that you actually need to protect them. And so you have the chief security officer and the CIO, who's the steward of the data, and the CEO, who's trying to most effectively run the business. And these three all agree that my digital assets and my data are the most important thing in this enterprise. However, the pressures and operational constraints of each one of them create conflict. And so what we want to do is get in a place where these three individuals can live harmoniously. And we kind of start this journey today, or this story, at the end, because we want these individuals to be happy and successful. And the reason we start at the end is because in order to get there, you really have to change convention and change the way we think about this problem. So let's go back to the beginning. It starts with data. So this is data. If you rode the bus, you've seen data. So data in its unstructured form, and his shirt's untucked, you can't see it, so we'll call him unstructured data. Data in its unstructured form accounts for around 80 to 90% of our organization's digital assets. So if you think about, most of the data we have is unstructured. Even if you look at structured data, which is data in databases, It becomes unstructured data once the minute the finance department gets their hands on it. Because if it's a bunch of financial data, they export it to Excel, and now it's unstructured data. This happens in HR. We have structured data in PeopleSoft, gets exported. Not structured data anymore, becomes unstructured. And all of this data sort of lives within our systems and creates issues as the organization grows. On average, there's about 300 terabytes of unstructured data within an enterprise today. Now, a lot of your organizations may be larger. You may have more data. I know a lot of the enterprises that we work with, sorry about that, have larger amounts of data. But on average, there's about 300 terabytes. And it costs roughly between $1,000 to $3,000 a terabyte per year to manage this data. So you can quickly do that math. It could be about $900,000 to manage this data on any given enterprise in any given year, right? And so this is the way we think about these things. We say, well, I have data, and then I have to manage it, and this is my cost, and so I'm looking for cost efficiencies. And that's actually part of the problem with applying a framework like ZEROTRUST. The other part of the problem is data is growing at an unprecedented rate. So every year we're creating new data, and this problem continues to get worse and worse as time goes on, right? So this isn't something that goes away. This is something that becomes more problematic over time. All right, so why should I care, right? Why shouldn't I just go on and continue to solve the problems the way I'm doing it and look for operational efficiencies, look for efficiencies within my architecture, leverage the cloud, and other things like this to sort of address some of these concerns around cost and growing data? This is the reason why. Because it's not a utility problem that requires a utility answer. It's a security problem. This, I think, took me about 45 seconds to Google all of these security events. And these are security events, ransomware, data leaks that have occurred since probably the end of July. Is probably, July 29th. So think about this time span. In just this short amount of time, these are just some of the cyber attacks, ransomware attacks that have occurred that have cost organizations real dollars, real time, and real resources to remediate. So this is really the scope of the problem and the way we should be thinking about it. We should be thinking about data from a security perspective, not from a utility perspective. Right now, cyber threats are sort of estimated to cost around $6 trillion and about $2 trillion on compliance. Now, the reason I tie these two things together is because they go hand in hand. Security is the act of protection, right? It is the controls we put in place to protect what it is we're trying to protect. And compliance is the proof. And the reason you need both is because if you do it once but don't continually do it, then you end up with a system that breaks down over time, and then the controls you initially put in place aren't adequate in the future, and then you end up with a loss, right? So these two things are intrinsically tied together. And you'll see, I mean, that's a significant globally dollar amount, right? So $8 trillion. And so if you think about the amount of data that's being created every day, and this problem is continuing to get exponentially worse, the cost for protecting and securing that data is even greater. All right, so how do we deal with this problem, right? We're all CIOs and thinking about how do we solve this? This is a pretty significant issue, and it's one that's not going away. I mean, this data is driving our business, so we have to deal with it, right? So let's rescope it. Let's try a way. Let's try to look at the problem in a manner where we can apply sort of a tangible model to it. And so I kind of like to think about data as currency, right? So we'll start here and say, let's pretend that if you went to Disney World last night and you went to Frontierland, let's pretend we're back in that time, right? And data is your money, and this is what you have. And so how would we do this? How would we solve the problem that way? Well, this is pretty easy. This is a pretty easy example, right? I'd stick it in a bank, and these are sort of the elements that would go into protecting that data or cash and the cash from a bank, right? And so this is something, obviously, everybody can wrap their head around because this model has existed for a long time, and we trust this model, right? We talk about zero trust, which means we don't trust anything, but you have to trust something, And in this, you trust the model because it is very simple to digest, and we know that it works over time because it's been proven over time. But we can't just apply this to data because this is a linear model. Right? This model requires protecting an asset that is only accessed linearly. Right? And by that I mean, so if you look at a bank, there's one door. There's a lot of windows, but they're fake. You can't get in through the windows. I don't know if anyone's ever crawled in through a bank window, but that's not possible. There's one door. There's one way in. Inside, you're going to have guards. You're going to have protections. You're going to have layers inside of that. There's a lot of people watching you. There's constraints. There's a vault. You don't ever see the vault. It's hidden in the back. And then there's cash inside the vault, right? Now, of course, this modern bank, this doesn't happen. We have digital currency, but let's pretend. In order to get at this cache or the manifestation of our data, you have to go through each one of these layers. And then in order to get it out, you have to go through each one of these layers again, right? So it is a very strong protection mechanism or protection model for that asset because it is very difficult to get in and out through that same path with all these protections. The second thing to note is there are not only protections at every level, so the whole ecosystem is protected, but there are protections extremely close to that asset, right, to that cache. The cache is inside the vault. There is almost nothing between the vault and the cache. It's right there. So the protections are as close to the asset as possible. Okay, so let's just apply this to data and call it a day. But that doesn't work. All right, before we get into why it doesn't work, this is how we design IT architectures today. This is how we view IT problems. This is how we've been viewing them for the last 20 or 30 years. We have the concept of an endpoint, we have an edge, and a core. And you'll hear marketing about all of these things over and over again. Collect data at the edge, process data at the edge, protect the endpoint, data at the core, which is in the data center. So all of these things happen, and the reality of today is that this model is actually disaggregated and replicated in almost every enterprise, right? When you talk about the cloud, that's like an infrastructure and an edge, and then the endpoint someplace else. But in an enterprise, all three of these are collapsed. But then those two things talk together, right? So you end up with this model where you have all of these segments of things that need to talk to each other, and it creates this very complex mess. So it's not a linear problem, right? We can't implement something to protect that data like we would implement a system or a model or infrastructure to protect cache because you cannot access data linearly. It is everywhere within our enterprise. In order to use it, it is not only at the core, but it's at the edge, and it's at the endpoint, and it's in the cloud, and it's everywhere, right? So we have to think about things from the perspective of the data. Now, if you probably ask some of your IT architects how they design systems or what your system is designed like today, you'll see that this is a pretty common model. I have strong external protections. I have visibility on the outside. So if you're in the security world, this is going to be like a security incident and event monitoring. It's going to be logging. You're going to be watching what's going on. I might have intrusion prevention, or intrusion detection systems. And there's all of these things that sit on the outside. They're sitting as a protection layer around the infrastructure, but not as a protection layer on the data. So what that does is creates a gap, right? So now you have a gap between the data and all the protections. And unlike the model where you have the cache in the vault, which is very close, this gap is very wide. So what problems does that gap create? That gap enables anybody who comes in through these various entry points, and if you're talking about everything from advanced persistent threats or cyber hacks or people that are surreptitiously getting into your network, or actually people who should be there in your infrastructure, trusted folks who have maybe some malware installed on their systems, they're in this infrastructure. There is no more this concept of this hard exterior and a trusted interior, and it's gone, right? And so we can't use these linear type external models to protect our data any longer. Some of the other problems that data creates is that it grows over time, right? And it's growing at an exponential rate. Unlike our cash example, it doesn't get depleted, right? I think we'd all like to hope that our cash grows forever in the bank, but it doesn't. We use it, it gets depleted. When you deplete cash, the risk level goes down because your loss is actually limited to that the amount of cash or that amount of that asset that's there. But that's not the same with data, right? As data increases, the risk doesn't get reduced at all. And sometimes when you try and associate a value with the data, the value of the data can vary over time, and it can be exponentially more than the actual piece of data itself, depending on what it is, right? The map to my building is not as valuable as the plans to build the next fighter jet, right? They're significantly different, right? And these are things that, again, increase, get harder to manage over time. Many people have access. It's hard to track, so you can kind of see that, applying these linear approaches, which is what we've done in the past. We've applied this linear approach. We put up a firewall and say, no one's getting in. Well, people are in, right? So we have to start thinking about things differently, right? How do we solve this problem in 2020 and beyond? All right, so what's the answer? So is it the cloud? All right, let's just run to the cloud, which a lot of us have been doing, and solve the problem that way. Well, the problem with the cloud, and some of you in this room may have experienced this already, is when you just do this and you think about things where I'm going to have my operational savings, or I think about it from a utility perspective, and you don't really think about the security perspective, it makes the problem worse, because the cloud it's someone else's infrastructure. They have things to make it easy. They have things to make it agile. They have things to reduce your operational costs. And those are all the benefits of the cloud. But it generally is not data security. Maybe infrastructure security, but not data security, right? And so the cloud isn't going to solve this problem for you, right? All right, so let's just pull it all back in my data center. That doesn't work either, right? We don't want to go that route. We just look to gain agility and efficiencies by leveraging the cloud. We don't want to pull it all back either. I want to be in a hybrid environment. The problem with my data center, too, is that it's really hard to find talent these days, right? Look at the unemployment rate. It's hovering around 3%. It is difficult to build secure infrastructures and do everything that's necessary to solve the problems we're trying to solve around data security with just my own resources, right? So this is not really the answer either. And so you can also say, well, I'll just use a service provider, right? Well, that's not going to work, because just making it someone else's problem, it's still your data, right? It's still your asset, right? So that doesn't work either. So the simple answer is there's no simple answer, right? This is why we have to start by thinking about the problem in a different way, right? We can't just slap on a technology and say, this is going to take us to where we need to be. It starts with changing the way we think about this problem, and not from a utility perspective, but actually from the context of the data, that we could actually start to chart a path to solving this and applying technologies in a way that can get us to where we need to be. So I don't know if any of you were at the keynote this morning where Malcolm Gladwell was talking about technology and how long it takes from the time a technology is invented to the time that it's actually adopted. Is usually a long period of time, right? In some instances, 20 to 30 years. And so the same holds true here, right? There are concepts and ideas that come about that are going to take time, right? And it really requires everybody to start thinking about the problem in a different way to get to the point where the technology and the infrastructure and everybody around us starts to think the same way, and we can address this issue. And so Zero Trust is a great example of how we can start that journey. It's just the beginning. Zero Trust actually showed up on the map almost a decade ago, right? I think was the first time Zero Trust was even written about. So it's been around for a while. The concepts of security within the enterprise in an ecosystem, end-to-end type model have been around for a while. And because of the climate today, with all of the, the increased cyber attacks and everything that I just showed on this slide prior, has really brought it to the forefront. But the problem is that it's really, if you Google Zero Trust, it talks about network security. And that's not what we're trying to solve for, right? We're trying to solve a data security problem, right? But let's first talk about what Zero Trust is in its current form, right? So what is Zero Trust? It's a framework for securing data, although it talks about it from the network's perspective, which is weird to me. It's like, why would I talk about it from that perspective? Why wouldn't I talk about it from the data's perspective? But that's what it is. It addresses these traditionally open architectures. And by traditionally open architectures, I mean a strong exterior and a weak interior, right? A trusted core. We don't have a trusted core anymore. You go in the cloud, you don't have a trusted anything, right? And I think, again, like there's a ton of examples of how the cloud could end up being a detriment in terms of data loss and efficiency from an infrastructure perspective, but massive liability from a data perspective, right? So Zero Trust really sets a framework that can apply both inside and outside of the network, right? We want an ecosystem. We want it end-to-end. We want protections as close to the data as possible. We want our data in a vault, just like the cache in a vault. We want to make this a linear problem. Although we can't, we want to bend it to our will to try and get it there because it's easier to solve. We use a lot of technologies to do that. And again, Zero Trust, the way it is today, talks a lot about network technologies, authentication, mutual TLS, PAM, all this other stuff that's network-based, network security-based. I think that you can see is that, well, if we're really just beefing up the network, we're really not beefing up the data, right? And so, again, it's sort of missing the point there, but this is what it talks about. We really need to keep up the pace with digital transformation. With our overall goal is improving our security and reducing risk, right? Nobody wants to be in the position where they lose data. It obviously could be very costly to an enterprise, to a business. It could be very embarrassing when it happens. If any of you are in highly regulated industries, especially in the finance world, you know what happens. They publish your name when you do something bad. It hits the news. Everybody knows you've done bad things. So we don't want to be there. We want to have controls in place that allow us to build infrastructures that can support the business and protect the data the way we need to protect it. So I wish we could just go to the shopping market and buy Zero Trust, but we can't. You can't buy it. It's not a thing. It's a model. You have to apply the model. And so it's a little bit more complex than, I know we all want to just go find the answer and, buy that and move forward, but we can't do it with that. And really, Zero Trust is based on a no-trust model. So if you remember, President Reagan would say, trust but verify, and that's sort of that's kind of the model we use. It's like, trust but verify. The current model is like strong exterior protections and weak interior protections, right? And so we kind of trust like once you're in the door, you're okay. But Zero Trust is really more about never trust and always verify. It's I'm going to assume that there's bad actors everywhere, and I'm not going to trust anybody. And you have to have this mindset because if you're leveraging the cloud or the edge or you have a distributed infrastructure, you can't trust anything, right? You always have to be thinking this way. So this is what you need to be thinking about and needs to be going through your mind when you're making these decisions. They're not technology decisions. They're really policy model framework decisions. Is what I'm putting in place actually going to solve the problem of protecting data, right? We really get excited about a technology or a product, but it's really like, is this actually going to solve my problem of protecting the data? And so this is where Zero Trust falls short right now. And you can't really retrofit a zero trust model into an existing infrastructure. Because in order to get to this don't trust anything, you have to go change everything, right? We have an architecture that was built 20 years ago, right? I'm sure a lot of your organizations have been around for a long time. Well, it was there. You can't just rip that out and start over. It's impossible, right? You need a greenfield effort to really apply this pure zero trust model. So out of the gate, it kind of stumbles because the concepts are good, but it's not really practical, right? You can't just go change everything. It's going to require expertise. Anything requiring security requires expertise. And you know, in the cyber world, there's negative unemployment right now. It's crazy that security professionals are extremely hard to find, right? So it's hard. It's hard to do this on your own. It's hard to go ahead and create an architecture that has all the pieces and parts that you need to actually implement a full zero trust model. And that's a deficiency with the architecture as well. Organizationally, we have siloed teams. So within an organization, you have infrastructure, or I&O, on one side. You have security on another side. CISOs don't necessarily report to CIOs. They report to CEOs, right? And so you have sort of this policy, security, infrastructure sort of, you know, triangle that goes on here. And that's again, it brings it back to the three individuals where you have these differences of operational and organizational challenges and way of doing business that aren't necessarily aligned, right? So it's hard to get zero trust to wrap that together if you were to just take the policy and implement it yourself. It's very network focused, right? We talk all day long about network security, and that's great, but you're still leaving the data exposed, and it's not very dynamic. And so if we were to take zero trust as it exists today and we don't think about it from the data perspective, if we say, all right, zero trust from a network perspective, let's just go with that, this is what you're going to end up with. You're going to end up with this hard outer shell with a soft GUI center, and data is going to be spilling out everywhere, because this is what happens when you don't think about it from the data's perspective and you don't actually have a end-to-end framework that addresses data security at every single point in that ecosystem. Because at the end of the day, nobody is stealing the network. How many data breaches of the network equipment have you heard of? No, zero, right? They steal the data. It's the data. And so that's really what we need to protect. And it's a complex problem, but it starts with perspective, thinking about things from the data's perspective, and then applying a model moving forward and applying technologies to solve it that way. So right now, I'm going to invite up Michael Daly, who's the CTO of Raytheon, to talk about something we call CyberConverged, right? And I'm sure everybody's familiar with a smartphone, iPhone. That's a converged device. And you think about the problems that has been able to solve by converging multiple technologies into a very enclosed form. There's not a lot of gaps in an iPhone, right? I can move from taking my pictures to putting them somewhere to editing them, all within a really tight context, right? And so convergence is really the combining of multiple technologies together to simply and efficiently solve a problem. And we look at cyberconvergence as a way to solve this within the IT world by taking security elements and combining them into every single level of the data management and data processing system. So Michael's going to talk a little bit about use case and some of the things that he's experienced. And so I'll pass this off to you.
Thanks. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Michael Daly, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Cybersecurity and Special Missions at Raytheon. And we're speaking together because we actually had a shared vision for where zero trust needs to go. It needs to move beyond this, network-centric view. In our space, which is to say the defense and intelligence space, we've applied much of those zero trust lines of thinking over the past 15 years even. So we've come to that point, and now we need to evolve it to the next level. So I've been in the cyber business about 35 years. I've been at Raytheon for the last 23 years. And what I'll talk about right now is a research and development project that we're working on. So this isn't like a thing for sale. It's our concept of where we think Zero Trust needs to go, and we're partnering here with RackTop to make it happen. As Eric said, we have in our customer set, which is to say large government, this explosion of data, and that's just ramping up because of the number of devices, the sensors and effectors and people on the networks and the converging of those parties that didn't work together before. The strategies of our customers are now data-centric strategies. Their very mission is dependent on the lakes of data that they're collecting. The infrastructure that they're using is no longer a compartment. It used to be that it would go into a closed area, and it was what we call an enclave, and they would reside in that space. And for cost reasons and data leverage reasons, that mission discussion around data, they've said, hey, we want to bring that data into some common spaces and common infrastructure to save money and make use of the data in a better way. And of course, there are new regulations around the handling of data. And we are also seeing a proliferation of tools to help us solve these cybersecurity problems, and it's making it extremely difficult for our cybersecurity practitioners to pivot in their chair from tool to tool to tool to chase down problems. Obviously, costs are escalating, and there is no new money. I'm sure you all know that. It's kind of a mantra in our IT business. If you're going to buy some new widget now, you really have to get rid of something else. And the breaches are continuing to happen despite this huge investment of dollars. I mean, look at the number of people at this conference. I mean, good Lord, that's a lot of money that this country is spending on cybersecurity and information security and information handling. And I promised you a chart over there, Gartner. It's my apology because there's somebody else's chart here, but it's the one I have. I won't dwell on this one, but what it's talking about is a problem that you all recognize, that we have spent money on controls, and those are the tall bars. The controls are things like data loss prevention, encryption, and secure file transfer. But they have not yet been as effective because we have not spent the money on data discovery and classification and other elements like that in order to apply those tools smartly. And why haven't we done it? Because it's just too damn hard. There is too much data. It moves from party to party. It gets tweaked all the time, and we really don't know exactly what we have and who is touching it and why they need it and when they need it. The problem is simply too complex. But we have some hope, and that's machine learning, artificial intelligence, and that's why we think now is the right time for us to really drive forward and invest some significant dollars in solving the automation and orchestration issues to bring zero trust down to the data level. For us, we thought we would apply, what we have in our toolbox, right? But there's more to it than that. We have built systems that we call battlefield command and control systems. For those of you who may have come from the military or the intelligence community, what that's about is understanding your assets. Hey, I've got these satellites out here, and they have this view of the Earth. I have these ground stations, radars. I have tanks. I have people. These are my assets available to prosecute a particular mission today. And when I am going to conduct an operation, I need to know which of those assets are available to do that mission now. Maybe they're busy doing something else. Maybe they're out of commission. They're in some sort of maintenance cycle. So I have to have visibility around those assets. Then I have to do what they call courses of action. Right? I need to understand what are all the different things that I might do to solve this problem, because you can skin that cat a bunch of different ways. Which one is the most likely to succeed, and what are the negative repercussions of each of those? Everything has some sort of downside to it. I might introduce, some latency. I might not get exactly the most precise answer. So courses of action. Well, we're going to take that mindset and apply it to the enterprise data space, the system space. Understand where are all of my systems, my people, every single data object and element, who is touching them, when, where, why, how, and as the cybersecurity operators, what can I do when things are going wrong? Some of that, most of it, had better be automated, because human beings cannot possibly get in the middle of every transaction. Some of it will have to be human intervention, though. what we call human in the loop. There are times when you want a human being to make the decision. So this is the research and development that we're collaborating on with RackTop and some others, and the goal is to give, for us, the warfighter, this control over their enterprise, but we truly believe that this is going to have applicability out in the wider world as that new model of zero trust, of understanding exactly what assets, information assets, and system assets we have, what state they're in, and the patterns of behavior, and then orchestrating that entire element together rather than pivoting on a chair and trying to figure out what to do. This is sort of the stack of features and things that we think we can bring. It's going to require a whole lot of us across industry. These are just a few elements of it. And it's going to combine system-level trust, hardware root of trust, software root of trust, all the way up. And then the thing at the top, that command center, is this battle management, command and control idea of managing all the moving parts and giving us situational awareness. So that's our vision, and I'll turn it back.
Thanks, Michael. So, one of the so you were actually able.
I'll comment on one thing. Yeah. Did you note the difference between a CEO chart, which said, "Why should I care?" and then like a big pile of money, and then a CTO chart, which had like graphics you can't see and lines and dots. And,
Again, the communication issue.
Yeah,
between
absolutely.
The,
He made me delete tons of stuff. There was more information, I swear.
But so I have one question about this, though, just to elaborate a little bit further. So you have done this sort of, I'll say, the hard way, right, for customers before, right, where you've implemented large amounts of teams in a program style where you write all the code and figure out how to do all this automation and figure out how to converge these technologies together to solve this problem. But, at the program level, like a very high budget level, where enterprises clearly can't do that, right? So
that's right.
That actually became the model for, your efforts to go ahead and try and put this down into an enterprise level form. And that's really what I look at as the first step to achieving zero trust, is the convergence of technologies around security, which is what CyberConvergence really is. And I look at it as the concrete example. As Michael pointed out, you have all of these pieces of technology that are coming together, centered around the data and data security, and they have to be merged and automated and orchestrated together because they cannot work in a disaggregated fashion and protect the data at the same time, right? So here's the old way. This is what we would do. I'd buy a product here and a product there and put one at the edge and put one at the endpoint, and I'm going to monitor logs, and I'm going to have a team, and then none of them talk to each other. None of them interoperate. But yet I'm expected to protect my data with that suite of tools, and my data is everywhere, right? So this is the old way that I do not believe, and we do not believe at RackTop is going to be able to solve the problem. And so specifically what we do and the part that we play in this ecosystem, because remember, it's an ecosystem, right? There needs to be people at the edge, and there needs to be people at the endpoint, but there is no delineation. There is no stopping line, right? It's got to go completely from beginning to end, full stack. And what we do, and what our specialty is protecting data where it lives, right within the storage system, right where it's stored, right? So that's what we do. All of our years of experience of doing this in the national intelligence agencies, and for national intelligence, we applied that and those key learnings directly to our technology, and that's the role we play within the enterprise. And that allows us to take that traditional model that I showed before, where you have this sort of hard exterior but a soft interior, and it allows you to get rid of that soft interior. You can put those protections as close to the data as possible, which is where we want to be, right? And so that's the concept of cyberconvergence. Our vision is that 10 years from now, we'll see many companies throughout the whole stack, throughout that whole ecosystem, applying these same sort of techniques, right? Everybody is embedding a level of security in everything that they do and how they play within the ecosystem. And then I believe we can actually solve this problem, right? All right, so what's the moral of the story today? Okay, so there's 3 takeaways, right? Starts with changing perspective. We can't think about security as a network problem anymore. Zero trust is not about the network. you have to think about it from the data's perspective. And once you start thinking about it that way, we could actually start to make steps to solve this problem. Zero Trust is actually a great framework and a great model that gives us an example of how we do that. But you can't take it at face value, right? Because it isn't a data-centric model. And CyberConvergence, we believe, is that concrete example of how we can start doing that today. And so I think the question you should all be asking is, what are we doing to protect data at the core? Because the core is not protected. And if you could ask that question, and you can put together systems and models and processes that solve that problem, then data doesn't have to worry anymore, and you could just be happy. And your CIO and your CISO and your CEO could be, sharing cheers in a bar and happy that they've actually solved their organizational challenges from here and beyond.
You can see which one's the CEO because he's trying to make his bottle taller than the others.
And so that's all I have for today. Thank you. I have 4 minutes left. If there are any questions, Jonathan could run around with a microphone. If we just want to make Jonathan run around with a microphone, that'd be fun too. Does anybody have any comments? Who wants a bourbon? There is. Jonathan's got the microphone. If you just raise your hand, he'll.
So thinking about large-scale IoT deployments, and you said that this is a good way to protect the core. What are your recommendations of how you protect data at the edge?
Okay, so the question was, what are the recommendations to protect data at the edge, right? And so I look at the edge as just a mini core. Because if you think about the amount of volume that we're going to collect, right? And when I think of edge, you can think about traditionally as like distributed facilities or, sort of a disaggregated enterprise. But when I think about the edge today, I think about IoT, right? I think about sensors. I think about data I'm getting from other resources. Now, some of that data may not need to be protected to the same level as others, but you're essentially creating a mini data center at the edge. So the principle is exactly the same. And actually, when you think about it that way, you kind of like, okay, this problem just got even worse. And so you really have to think about it in the same way. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that what you're doing out at the edge is very similar to what you're doing back at the core. Your core is just your repository. So, a lot of what I did in the past had this model, right? We'd go out to a far-off land. We'd do a lot of stuff. We'd get a lot of data. We'd chew through it there. We'd send a bunch back home. We'd keep some. We'd get rid of some, right? That model, you can apply that to making a movie. Shoot on set. Take it back home, edit it, right? Same process. But that data, your edge is a mini core, right? So you have to think about it the same way. You have to apply the same protections, and everything has to be compatible, right? We can't do something out here because it's cheaper and something in here because that's like central IT and they have a different budget. No, you have to be compatible. You have to be thinking about things the same way. You have to think about the whole thing in the same context of the data.
Sir?
Yep.
So when you're talking about encrypting the disks, it looked like with your presentation,
yeah.
Would that be like physical disks in the data center, or how do you deal with like it's VMDK, for example?
Yeah, so great question. So the question is how do you deal with encryption? And encryption is, when people think of security, data security, they think of encryption, and then we're going to call it a day. That is not data security. But yes, so you want to have encryption at multiple levels. And it's because you may have data entrusted by different resources who need to have different keys to access that data at different times, right? So it's kind of a complex answer because the problem is complex. So what we do is we protect data at 2 levels. We protect it at the physical layer, then we protect it at the logical layer again. So if it's a virtual machine, it doesn't matter what it is, that it's protected at 2 different layers with 2 different sets of keys so that you can actually, move the data around and meet the goals that you have around security, and you're not tied into sort of one set of constraints around that. But security, when it comes to encryption, there's the encryption piece, then there's the key management piece. A lot of encryption is implemented using password types or pins, things of that nature. If somebody knows that, you don't really have secure encryption, right? You want to entrust those. Those keys need to be generated by a root of trust that nobody has access to, no human has access to. And so the management of that becomes really complicated. That's one of the things we automate within our product completely, is because that is the hard part of dealing with encryption, is making sure that whole process is completely automated and human-free, because once a human's involved, forget it. Somebody knows the password, somebody knows the PIN, somebody has access to that key, and it's done. So it's really encryption at multiple layers, automated key management, and that's how you get that level of base level, what I call base level of data security. So I think my time is up, but thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you joining us for this session. We're downstairs, booth 413 downstairs. We have a bunch of cool T-shirts. If you want to come up to the front, we have T-shirts here. You can meet us in the booth downstairs if you want a T-shirt as well. I'm happy to answer any questions outside.
Thank you for listening. Please visit Gartner.com/events for a list of upcoming events.